What's a mystery that still hasn't been solved but fascinates you? Story 1. Consciousness is one of those mysteries that's so close to you that it almost feels invisible. Like it's the one thing you experience constantly, yet understand the least. Because when you really think about it, everything you know, everything you feel, every thought, memory, emotion, all of it exists inside this subjective experience that we just kind of take for granted. You're aware. You're you. But what does that actually mean? We can map the brain, study neurons, track electrical activity, understand which regions light up during certain tasks, emotions, or decisions. But none of that really explains why there's an experience attached to it. Why does it feel like something to you? Why is there an inner world at all? And that's the part that's hard to wrap your head around, because it's not just a missing detail in our understanding, it's a gap between two completely different things, physical processes on one side, and subjective experience on the other. You can describe the brain in incredible detail, but that doesn't explain why you see colors, hear sounds, or have a sense of self moving through time. And the weirdest part is, you can't step outside of it. You can study everything else from the outside, but consciousness is the one thing you are trapped inside while trying to understand it, which makes it feel almost impossible to fully grasp. It's like trying to look at your own eyes without a mirror, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Because it's not some distant mystery out in space or buried underground. It's the thing you're using to think about the mystery in the first place. Which means the answer, whatever it is probably right there, but also somehow completely out of reach. Story 2. Dreams are one of those things that feel completely normal while they're happening. And then the moment you wake up, you realize how strange they actually are. Because think about it, your brain basically shuts off your body, disconnects you from the outside world, and then just starts generating entire experiences out of nothing. Not just random images, but full scenes, conversations, emotions, sometimes even storylines that feel real while you're in them. And the weirdest part is how convincing they are. While you're dreaming, you don't question it. You can be somewhere impossible, talking to people who aren't there, doing things that don't make sense, and your brain just accepts it like it's completely normal. It's only after you wake up that you go, wait, what was that? And even then, it fades fast. Like your brain doesn't want you holding on to it too clearly, and we still don't fully understand why it happens. There are theories, memory processing, emotional regulation, problem solving, but none of them really explain the full experience, especially the really vivid or bizarre dreams that don't seem to connect directly to anything obvious. Then you've got things like recurring dreams, lucid dreaming, where you realize you're dreaming and can control it, or those moments where a dream feels more real than waking life for a few seconds after you open your eyes. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it's not just random noise, it's your mind creating a second reality every night, one that you fully participate in, feel emotions in, react to, and then it just disappears. Gone by morning, like it never existed. And the fact that this happens to everyone, every single night, and we still don't really understand what it is or why it feels the way it does, makes it one of those everyday mysteries that's hiding in plain sight. Story 3. The Sea Peoples are one of those mysteries that feel like they should have a clear answer by now, but somehow still sit right in that frustrating space where we know just enough to be intrigued and not enough to actually explain them. Because they show up at a very specific moment in history, right around the collapse of several major Bronze Age civilizations. And suddenly, you've got chaos spreading across the Eastern Mediterranean. Cities burning, trade networks collapsing, entire regions destabilizing. And in Egyptian records, especially under Pharaoh Ramesses III, you get these descriptions of groups attacking by sea, arriving in ships, sometimes even bringing families with them. Like they weren't just raiders, but migrating populations. And that's where the name comes from. Sea Peoples, not a single tribe, not a clearly defined nation, more like a label for multiple groups that all seem to be part of this movement. And that's the first problem, because instead of one origin, you might be looking at several. Some theories point to the Aegean, others to Western Asia Minor, Mediterranean islands, even parts of Southern Europe. But nothing lines up cleanly enough to say, this is who they were, which makes them feel more like a phenomenon than a people. Like something triggered movement on a large scale, climate stress, famine, political collapse. And groups started moving, raiding, displacing others, creating this chain reaction that shows up in the archaeological record as destruction layers across multiple sites. And then, they stop being visible as sea peoples. Some may have settled, some absorbed into other cultures, some just disappeared from the record entirely. And that's what makes it so fascinating, because you can clearly see the impact. You can see where cities were destroyed, where societies shift, where Egypt barely held on against them, but the actual identity behind it all is still incomplete. And that's the unsettling part, because it's not like they didn't exist. It's that they existed strongly enough to help reshape an entire region, and still left behind no clear, unified explanation of who they were, which makes history feel less like a clean narrative, and more like something where major events can happen and still not be fully understood. Story 4. Why is there something instead of nothing? Is one of those questions that sounds simple, but the second you actually try to think it through, it kind of breaks your brain in a quiet way. Because everything we normally ask about has context. There's always a cause, a before, a reason, something you can trace back to something else. But this question sits underneath all of that. It's not asking why something specific exists. It's asking why anything at all exists. Why is there a universe, matter, energy, time, space, any of it, instead of just absolute nothing? And the problem is, we don't even really have a good way to define nothing. Because even empty space isn't truly nothing, it still has properties, fluctuations, potential. So, when people imagine nothing, they're usually imagining something very abstract that we've never actually observed. And that's where it gets weird, because every explanation seems to hit a wall. If you say the universe had a beginning, then what caused that beginning? If you say it always existed, then why does it exist at all instead of not existing? If you bring in physics, you can describe how things evolve, how the universe expands, how particles behave. But you still haven't answered why there is something for those laws to apply to in the first place. And the unsettling part is that this might not be a question we're equipped to answer. Not because we haven't figured it out yet, but because it might sit outside the kind of reasoning we can use. It's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen. You can think around it, approach it, describe the edges of the problem, but never quite reach the center. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it's not just a mystery about the universe, it's a mystery about existence itself. The kind of question that doesn't just lack an answer, it kind of dissolves the idea of what an answer would even look like. And once you really sit with it, it doesn't just feel like an interesting question, it feels like the deepest one there is. Story 5. The idea of the edge of space is one of those things that seems like it should be easy to imagine at first, but the longer you sit with it, the more it kind of unravels into something your brain just refuses to process properly. Because everything we understand about reality is built around boundaries, limits, and edges that separate one thing from another, and space just doesn't seem to follow those rules in any intuitive way. Because if you try to imagine space having an actual end, like a boundary where everything just stops, you immediately run into a problem, since any kind of edge implies there's something beyond it. And the moment you ask what's on the other side of that edge, you've basically created more space again, which defeats the idea of it being an end in the first place. So it can't really be like a wall or a barrier in any sense we understand. But then the alternative is just as unsettling, maybe even more so. Because if space doesn't end at all, if it just keeps going forever in every direction with no limit, no boundary, no final point where it stops, then you're dealing with true infinity. And that's something we can describe mathematically, but can't actually picture in any meaningful way. because our minds are not built to handle something that has no edges, no center, no outside. And what makes it even stranger is that modern physics doesn't really give a clean, satisfying answer either, because some models suggest the universe could be finite but unbounded, meaning it doesn't go on forever but also doesn't have an edge. Kind of like the surface of a sphere where you can keep traveling without ever hitting a boundary, which somehow feels even more confusing than either option on its own. So, you're left with this situation where every possible explanation feels wrong in some way, either because it leads to an infinite regress of what's beyond that, or because it introduces concepts that don't fit into how we experience reality at all. And that's what makes it so unsettling, because it's not just a mystery we haven't solved yet. It's something that might not even be fully understandable in human terms. And once you really start thinking about it, it kind of pulls the ground out from under your sense of reality a little bit, because it shows that something as fundamental as the shape and limits of the universe doesn't behave in a way that lines up with how we expect things to work. And that gap between expectation and reality is exactly what makes space feel so eerie to think about. Story 6, the question of whether there is sentient life elsewhere in the universe, is one of those things that feels like it should have an obvious answer, given how big everything is. And yet the fact that we don't know makes it way more unsettling than if the answer were simply yes or no. Because when you look at the scale of the universe, it almost seems impossible that we would be alone, since there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars, many of those stars having planets, and statistically it feels like life, even intelligent life, should have emerged somewhere else at least a few times. But then you run into the silence. No confirmed signals, no clear evidence, no undeniable contact, just this vast, empty quiet, where you would expect at least something to show up if intelligent life were common. And that's where it starts to get weird, because either intelligent life is incredibly rare, meaning we might be one of the only examples, which is a huge responsibility to even think about, or it's actually common, and for some reason we're not seeing it, which opens up a whole different set of uncomfortable possibilities. Maybe civilizations don't last very long. Maybe they destroy themselves before they can spread far enough to be noticed. Maybe they exist but don't communicate in ways we can detect. Or maybe they're out there and we're just too early, or too far away, or too limited to recognize them. And then there's the part that really sticks with people, which is that no matter which explanation you lean toward, none of them feel reassuring. If we're alone, that's isolating in a way that's hard to fully process. If we're not alone, then the question becomes where they are, what they're like, and why we haven't encountered them yet. And that's what makes it so fascinating, because it's not just a scientific question, it's something that changes how you see humanity itself, whether we're a rare accident in a mostly empty universe, or just one small example in something much larger that we haven't been able to perceive yet. And the fact that we don't have a clear answer, even with all the technology we've developed, just leaves it sitting there as this huge open question that feels like it should be answered. But it isn't. Story 7, Malaysia Airlines Flight 37, is one of those mysteries that feels especially unsettling because it didn't happen in some distant, poorly documented time. It happened in the modern world, with radar, satellites, communication systems, and yet it still managed to just disappear. Because this wasn't a small aircraft or an isolated flight path, it was a large commercial plane with 239 people on board, flying a routine route in 2014, and for a while everything seemed completely normal. And then it deviates. Its transponder stops transmitting, it changes course in a way that doesn't match any standard procedure, and instead of continuing along its planned route, it turns and flies for hours over open ocean, largely out of sight, with only faint satellite data giving clues about where it might have gone. And that's where things start to feel unreal, because despite one of the largest and most expensive search efforts in history, involving multiple countries, advanced technology, and years of scanning the ocean floor, the main wreckage has never been definitively located. There have been pieces of debris found on distant shorelines, which confirm that the plane likely ended up in the Indian Ocean, but the full story, what exactly happened on board, why the course changed, what the final moments were, is still unknown. And that's the part that makes it stick. Because we live in a time where it feels like everything is tracked, monitored, recorded, where it seems like something that big shouldn't be able to just vanish without a clear explanation. But it did. And the idea that a modern aircraft, in an age of global connectivity, can still disappear in a way that leaves behind more questions than answers, makes the world feel a little less controlled than we'd like to believe. Because it's not just a mystery from the past, it's one that's still open, still unresolved, and still waiting for an answer that might never come. Story 8, How Life Began, is one of those mysteries that feels almost impossible to fully grasp, because it's not just a missing detail in history, it's the moment where everything we consider alive somehow emerged from something that wasn't. Because at some point, on an early Earth that was nothing like what we see today, you had chemistry, just reactions, molecules interacting, no intention, no awareness, no life. And then somehow, through processes we still don't completely understand, that chemistry crossed a threshold into biology. Something started replicating, something started maintaining itself, something started evolving. And that transition is where things get really strange. Because we can recreate parts of it in labs, we can simulate early Earth conditions, form organic molecules, even create systems that behave in lifelike ways. But we haven't been able to fully bridge that gap from non-living to living in a way that explains exactly how it first happened naturally. There are theories, primordial soups, hydrothermal vents, RNA worlds, all of them plausible, all of them supported by pieces of evidence, but none of them give a complete, definitive picture. And the unsettling part is how it seems to have happened at least once, which means it's possible, but we don't know how likely it is. Was it almost inevitable, something that happens whenever the conditions are right? Or was it incredibly rare, a kind of cosmic accident that just happened to occur here, and that uncertainty changes how you look at everything else? Because if life is common, then the universe might be full of it in forms we haven't discovered yet. But if it's rare, then every living thing on Earth is part of something extremely unusual, something that might not have happened anywhere else. And that's what makes it so fascinating, because it's not just about the past. It's about understanding what life actually is at its most basic level, and why it exists at all. And the fact that we can study it, break it down, analyze it in incredible detail, but still not fully explain how it started in the first place, leaves this gap at the very beginning of everything we know, a starting point that we can approach, but I haven't quite reached it yet. Story 9, Where do we come from and where do we go, is one of those questions that feels simple when you say it out loud, but the more you sit with it, the more it expands into something that touches literally everything about existence. Because on one level, we do have answers. We come from evolution, from a long chain of life going back billions of years, from stars that form the elements in our bodies, from processes that can be traced scientifically step by step if you zoom out far enough. But that kind of answer only gets you so far, because it explains the how, not the why. It doesn't really capture what it means to be here, conscious, aware, experiencing things in real time, asking the question in the first place. And then you get to the second part, where do we go? And that's where it becomes even more uncertain. Physically, we know what happens to the body, we understand biology, decay, the cycle of matter, but when it comes to experience, to awareness, to whatever it is that makes you feel like you, there isn't a clear, universally accepted answer. Some people see it as the end, some see it as a transition. Some think consciousness might be tied so closely to the brain that it simply stops, while others believe there's something more that continues in ways we don't understand. And none of those answers are something you can verify in a way that feels final, which is what makes the question stick. because it sits right at the intersection of science, philosophy, and personal experience, and no matter how far you push in any direction, you eventually reach a point where things become uncertain again. And that uncertainty isn't necessarily negative, but it is powerful, because it means that for all the knowledge we've accumulated, for all the things we can explain in incredible detail, the biggest questions about existence itself are still open, and maybe always will be. Which makes it less about finding a final answer, and more about the fact that we're here, aware enough to even ask the question, moving through something we don't fully understand, trying to make sense of it as we go. And in a strange way, that might be part of the answer too. Story 10. This is a very small mystery that most people don't know or care about, but we don't know exactly who the last man rescued from the sinking of the USS Indianapolis was. For people who need some background, the USS Indianapolis was a ship that was sunk in World War II after delivering critical components of the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. Due to a series of errors, the ship was not reported missing, and the survivors of the sinking floated in the Pacific for several days before being spotted by chance by a passing plane. They dealt with dehydration, exposure, injuries from the sinking, horrible sunburns, and famously, some shark attacks. Many people know of this disaster because Quint told the story in Jaws. There were two men who both claimed to be the last survivor pulled from the water. It's completely understandable that their memories could be fuzzy and false, given what they had gone through, and I don't believe that either one of them was lying about it. Their raft was the last one with survivors that was found 5 days after the sinking, but nobody knows for sure the order in which they were pulled out, and which one was indeed the last man rescued from the sea after enemy action of World War II. Story 11. What's inside the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang is one of those mysteries that feels almost frozen in time on purpose, like we're standing right at the edge of something enormous and choosing not to fully look inside yet, because we already know a lot about what surrounds it. The Terracotta Army alone is massive. Thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, chariots, all arranged as if they're still guarding the emperor in the afterlife, which already gives you a sense of how much effort and planning went into this entire complex. But that's just the outer layer. The actual tomb chamber itself, the central burial site of Qin Shi Huang, has never been properly opened or excavated. And according to historical accounts, especially from ancient texts, what's inside sounds almost unreal. Descriptions talk about a kind of miniature empire built underground, complete with rivers and seas, represented using liquid mercury, flowing through the tomb to symbolize the geography of China, along with ceilings decorated to resemble the night sky. Constellations mapped out above. And what makes it even more unsettling is that modern surveys have detected unusually high levels of mercury in the soil around the tomb, which lines up eerily well with those ancient descriptions. So, it's not just a legend, there might be truth to it. And yet, it remains unopened. Partly out of caution, because opening something that old could damage whatever is inside before we have the technology to properly preserve it. And partly because once it's opened, that untouched state, something sealed for over 2,000 years, is gone forever. So it just sits there. A fully intact imperial tomb, potentially filled with things no one has seen since it was sealed, with details that might confirm or completely change what we think we know about that time. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it's not a lost mystery, it's a waiting one, something that exists right now, buried, known, but not revealed. And the fact that we're choosing not to open it yet almost makes it feel even more mysterious than if we already had. Story 12. The Bermuda Triangle is one of those mysteries that almost everyone hears about as a kid. And for a while, it feels like this huge, unexplained anomaly in the world, like there's this specific patch of ocean where things just go wrong for reasons no one can fully explain, because the stories are what make it stick. Ships disappearing without a trace, planes losing contact mid-flight, compasses acting strangely. experienced crews suddenly gone, all concentrated in this triangular area between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, which gives it this almost defined, almost intentional feeling like it's a place rather than just a coincidence. And when you're younger, it's easy to imagine it as something almost supernatural, like there's some force there, something hidden beneath the surface, or in the air that disrupts everything that passes through it. But the more you learn, the more complicated it gets. Because while there have definitely been incidents, a lot of them start to have explanations. Navigation errors, weather patterns, human mistakes, strong currents, even the fact that it's just a heavily traveled region where statistically more things are going to happen. And yet, it still doesn't fully lose that feeling. Because even when explanations exist, the concentration of stories, the way they're told, the idea of something vanishing without a clear trace, still lingers in the background. It's one of those mysteries that lives more in the space between fact and interpretation. Not completely unexplained, but not completely satisfying either. And that's probably why it sticks with so many people. Because it was one of those first mysteries that made you realize the world isn't entirely predictable. That even in places we think we understand, things can happen that feel just a little off, a little unresolved. And even if the reality is more grounded than the legend, that initial feeling of something's not right there never really goes away completely. Story 13. The assassination of John F. Kennedy is one of those mysteries that has been studied, investigated, and debated for decades, and yet somehow still feels unresolved in a way that keeps people coming back to it over and over again. Because on paper, there is an official explanation. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, fired the shots in Dallas in 1963, and multiple investigations, including the Warren Commission, concluded that there wasn't a larger conspiracy behind it. But the moment you start looking at the details, the timeline, the evidence, the witness accounts, it starts to feel less clean than that simple explanation suggests. There are inconsistencies people point to, questions about how events unfolded, debates about the number of shots, angles, timing, Oswald's own background and connections, and then the fact that he himself was killed before a full trial ever happened, which removed the possibility of a definitive courtroom conclusion. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because instead of a clear resolution, you end up with layers of interpretation, theories ranging from lone actor to involvement by organized crime, intelligence agencies, foreign governments, or combinations of multiple factors, none of which have been proven conclusively, but none of which have been completely dismissed in the minds of many people either. And what makes it stick isn't just the event itself, it's what it represents. The idea that something so significant, involving one of the most powerful figures in the world, could happen in broad daylight, in front of cameras, witnesses, and still leave behind this level of uncertainty. Because we're used to thinking that with enough investigation, enough time, enough information, we eventually get a clear answer. And in this case, we didn't. Or at least, not one that everyone accepts, which is what keeps it alive as a mystery. Not just what happened, but whether we truly know the full story, and the possibility that we might not, is what makes it so enduring. Story 14. Black holes and dark matter are two of those mysteries that feel especially unsettling because they're not hidden in the past or buried somewhere we haven't dug yet. They're part of the universe right now, shaping everything around us, and we still don't fully understand what they actually are. Because black holes on their own already push things to the edge of what makes sense. You've got regions of space where gravity becomes so intense that not even light can escape, where matter collapses into something incredibly dense, and beyond a certain point, the event horizon, we literally can't see what's happening anymore. And that's not just a gap in observation, it's a limit. A boundary where our current understanding of physics starts to break down, because the equations that describe gravity and the ones that describe quantum behavior don't fully agree on what's going on inside. So, There's this whole region of reality that we know exists, but can't directly access or fully describe. And that's just one part of it. Then you've got dark matter, which is even stranger in a different way because unlike black holes, we don't even know what it's made of. We just know it has to be there. Because when we look at galaxies, the way they rotate doesn't make sense if you only account for the matter we can see. There's not enough visible mass to hold everything together. So something else is there. Something invisible, not interacting with light, not directly detectable with current instruments, but still exerting gravitational influence on a massive scale. And when you add it all up, this invisible stuff makes up most of the matter in the universe, which is wild because it means everything we can see, stars, planets, galaxies, all the normal matter, is just a small fraction of what's actually out there. And that's what makes it so fascinating, because it's not just that we don't know everything, it's that a huge portion of reality is made up of things we can't directly observe, things we can only infer from their effects. So, you've got black holes, where something exists that we can't look inside, and dark matter, where something exists that we can't even see at all. And together, they kind of highlight the same idea, that even with everything we've discovered, everything we can measure and map and model, there are still fundamental parts of the universe that remain just out of reach. Not because they're far away, but because we don't yet have the tools, or maybe even the right framework, to fully understand them. And that gap between what we can see and what we know must be there is what makes it all feel just a little bit eerie. Story 15. What really happens when we die is one of those mysteries that feels impossible to ignore, because unlike most other questions, this isn't something abstract or distant. It's something that applies to every single person, and yet we still don't have a clear, universally accepted answer to it. Because on a biological level, we understand a lot. The body shuts down, the heart stops, the brain loses oxygen, neural activity fades, and eventually everything that keeps the body functioning just ceases, and that part, while serious, is actually the least mysterious piece of it. But the real question isn't just about the body, it's about consciousness. It's about that sense of you, the awareness, the experience, the internal perspective that you've had your entire life. And what happens to that when the brain that generates it stops working? And that's where things get uncertain very quickly. Some perspectives say that consciousness is entirely tied to the brain. So when the brain stops, the experience stops too, like a light being turned off. No continuation, no awareness, just an end. Other perspectives suggest that consciousness might not be fully understood yet, that there could be aspects of it that aren't entirely explained by current science, leaving open the possibility of something continuing in some form, even if we don't know what that would look like. And the unsettling part is that we can't really observe it directly. We can study the brain, measure activity, look at what happens leading up to death, but we can't step into that final moment from the inside and come back with a clear answer about what it's actually like. So, it becomes one of those questions where every explanation feels incomplete. Not necessarily wrong, but not fully satisfying either. And that's what makes it so powerful, because it's not just about what happens physically. It's about what happens to experience itself, and whether it ends, transforms, or continues in a way we can't currently understand. And the fact that something so universal, so inevitable, is still something we can't fully explain, is what makes it one of the deepest mysteries there is. Not because it's hidden somewhere far away, but because it's something we're all moving toward without ever being able to fully see what's on the other side. Story 16. Jack the Ripper is one of those mysteries that sticks with people, not because of the scale of what happened, but because of how strangely incomplete the whole story still feels, even after all this time and attention. Because you're right, there have been far worse, more prolific killers in history, cases with clearer evidence, clearer timelines, even clearer identities. But something about this one just refuses to settle into a clean explanation. Part of it is the setting. Late 1800s, London, specifically Whitechapel, which already had this atmosphere of overcrowding, poverty, dimly lit streets, and a kind of anonymity where people could disappear into the background, and that environment just amplifies everything that happened there. Then you've got the crimes themselves, which were brutal, yes, but also carried this strange level of precision and pattern so that made people at the time believe they were dealing with someone calculated, someone who understood what they were doing in a way that felt deliberate rather than chaotic. And then there's the investigation, or more accurately, the lack of resolution. You've got letters, suspects, witness accounts, theories that range from plausible to completely out there, but no definitive answer, no moment where everything clicks into place and you can say with certainty, this was the person. And that absence is what keeps it alive. Because most cases, even the disturbing ones, eventually get closed in some way, even if it takes years. This one didn't. It just stopped. The killings ended, the figure disappeared, and all that was left was speculation. And over time, that gap gets filled with theories, reinterpretations, new angles, but none of them fully close it, which turns it into something more than just a historical case. It becomes a kind of open loop in history, something that invites people back again and again, trying to make sense of something that never fully resolved. And I think that's why it sticks. Not because it's the worst, but because it's unfinished. And there's something about an unfinished mystery, especially one set in such a specific atmospheric time and place, that makes it feel like it's still just slightly out of reach, even now. Story 17. The pyramids are one of those things that you think you understand when you're younger, like they're just these big ancient structures built by a civilization we've already studied and explained. But the older you get, the more you realize that even with all the knowledge we have, they still sit there as something quietly mysterious in a way that never fully goes away. Because on the surface, we do know a lot. We know roughly when they were built, who built them, the tools they had, the purpose behind them, the cultural and religious significance, and the general methods that were likely used to construct them, and none of that is really in doubt anymore. But then you start thinking about the scale of it, the precision, the alignment, the sheer coordination required to move and place those massive stones with that level of consistency over long periods of time without modern machinery, without the kind of infrastructure we take for granted today. And even if there are explanations for how it could have been done, there's still this lingering sense of, that's incredible, that doesn't fully resolve into something ordinary. And I think what really changes as you get older isn't just how you see the pyramids, it's how you see everything else around them. Because you start to realize that history isn't as clean or as complete as it felt when you first learned it. That even well-studied subjects still have gaps, still have unanswered questions, and still have aspects that rely on interpretation rather than certainty. So, the pyramids stop being just a single mystery and start feeling like a symbol of a much bigger one. The idea that the world, past and present, is full of things we understand partially, things we've explained just enough to move forward, but not enough to feel like we've truly grasped them completely. And that realization can be a little unsettling, but also kind of fascinating at the same time. Because it means there's always more beneath the surface, always more to learn, more to question, more to uncover, even in things we think we already know. And the pyramids, just sitting there, unchanged for thousands of years, kind of embody that feeling perfectly. Not something we don't understand at all, but something we don't fully understand either, which is sometimes even more intriguing. Story 18. How ancient civilizations managed to move massive stones over long distances and then assemble them with such precision is one of those mysteries that doesn't come from a lack of explanations, but from how difficult it is to truly picture those explanations playing out in reality. Because when you hear the theories, sledges, rollers, manpower, leverage, carefully coordinated labor over long periods of time, they all make sense individually, and there's solid evidence that these methods were used in different places. But then you look at something like Stonehenge, or those Incan walls where irregular stones fit together so tightly you can't even slide a piece of paper between them, and it stops feeling like a simple engineering problem and starts feeling like something far more refined. Not impossible, but incredibly precise. And that's where the fascination comes in. Because it's not just about moving heavy objects, it's about control. Control over weight, balance, alignment, shaping, and placement. All without modern tools, without cranes, without machines, relying entirely on human coordination, knowledge, and technique. And in the case of the Incas especially, the stones aren't even uniform. They're irregular, uniquely shaped, yet somehow carved and fitted together in a way that looks almost seamless. Like each piece was designed specifically for the space it occupies, which means whoever did it had to account for every angle, every curve, every point of contact. And that level of craftsmanship suggests something deeper than just brute force. It suggests experience, iteration, methods that were refined over time, possibly techniques that were so ingrained in the culture that they didn't need to be written down in a way that survived. And that's the part that sticks. Because we can recreate aspects of it, we can demonstrate that it's possible, but there's still this gap between knowing how it could be done and fully understanding how it was done so consistently, at such scale, across different civilizations. And once you start thinking about that, it kind of shifts your perspective, because it reminds you that just because something doesn't leave behind detailed instructions doesn't mean it wasn't understood at the time. It just means that knowledge can exist, be used, and then be lost in ways that leave behind only the results. And those results, sitting there for centuries or millennia, still feel impressive enough that even now, with all our technology, they make you stop and think, how exactly did they pull that off so well? Story 19. What happened to the body of Alexander the Great is one of those mysteries that feels especially strange, because for a long time, it wasn't lost at all. It was one of the most famous visible relics in the ancient world, because after his death, his body was preserved and placed in a tomb in Alexandria. And it wasn't hidden away or forgotten, it was actually on display, visited by rulers, seen by important figures, something people could point to and say, that's him. So, for centuries, there wasn't really a mystery. Everyone knew where Alexander was. And then, sometime in the late 4th century, he's just gone. No clear record of removal, no confirmed relocation, no definitive explanation, just a gradual disappearance from the historical record until no one could say for certain where his remains ended up. And that's what makes it so unsettling in a quiet way. Because it's not like he was buried in some unknown place to begin with, or lost to time in the usual sense. He was known, visible, accessible, and then somehow that continuity breaks, which raises all kinds of possibilities. Was the tomb destroyed? Was the body moved for protection? Was it looted, hidden, repurposed, misidentified over time? And then you get theories like the one you mentioned, that his remains might actually be in Venice, possibly beneath St. Mark's Basilica, effectively sitting in plain sight under a completely different identity, which, if true, would be one of those almost surreal outcomes where one of the most famous individuals in history never really disappeared. He was just recontextualized. And that's the part that sticks, because it shows how something can go from being universally known to completely uncertain, not because it vanishes instantly, but because records fade, contexts change, and over time, even the most important things can lose their clear connection to the present. And when that happens, you're left with this strange gap, a person we know more about than almost anyone from that era, and yet we don't know where he physically ended up. Which feels like the kind of detail that shouldn't be missing, but it is. Story 20. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those mysteries that keeps pulling people back in, not because there are no explanations at all, but because none of them seem to fully account for how strange the details are when you put everything together. because on paper, it starts as a straightforward expedition. A group of experienced hikers, young, fit, well-prepared, heading into the Ural Mountains in the winter of 1959, something difficult but not beyond their capabilities, especially given their level of training. And then something happens. At some point during the night, they leave their tent, but not in a normal way. The tent is cut open from the inside, like they needed to get out immediately without taking the time to use the entrance, which already suggests urgency, maybe even panic. And then you look at how they were found. Not all together. Scattered in small groups, some closer to the tent, others farther away, as if they were trying to move, regroup, or survive in stages rather than all at once. And the condition they were in is what really makes it unsettling. Some were found without proper clothing for the environment, which doesn't make sense unless something caused confusion or disorientation, because these were experienced hikers who understood the risks of exposure. Others had severe injuries, but not the kind you'd expect from a typical struggle, more like high-impact trauma without obvious external wounds, which led to comparisons with forces you wouldn't normally associate with a campsite. And then there are the smaller details that make everything feel just slightly off. The reports of some clothing having traces of radiation. The burns were found on a couple of individuals. The missing soft tissue, which, as you mentioned, is likely explained by post-mortem animal activity, but still adds to the overall strangeness when you're looking at the case as a whole. So, when people try to explain it, you get a range of theories. Avalanche, which would explain the sudden escape. Hypothermia, which can lead to paradoxical undressing. Environmental factors. Panic. Disorientation in extreme conditions. All of which are plausible individually. But when you try to line them all up into one clean sequence of events, something always feels slightly incomplete, like there's a missing piece that would make everything click, but we don't quite have it, and that's why it sticks. Because it's not that there's no explanation, it's that none of them feel fully satisfying when you consider every detail together. So, it sits there, in that uncomfortable space between known and unknown, where you can see parts of what likely happened, but not the whole picture, and that gap is what keeps it fascinating. Story 21. The idea that the flow of time might be an illusion is one of those concepts that doesn't feel disturbing at first. But the more you sit with it, the more it kind of quietly destabilizes everything you take for granted about reality. Because in everyday life, time feels like the most obvious thing there is. It moves forward, moment by moment. The past is behind you, the future is ahead, and the present is this thin slice you're constantly moving through. And that sense of progression feels so natural that it's almost impossible to question. But then you get into physics, and things start to look very different. In some interpretations, especially in relativity, time is treated more like a dimension, similar to space, which means that past, present, and future might all exist in a kind of fixed structure, sometimes described as a block universe, where nothing is actually moving, and everything that has happened or will happen is already part of the same system. And if that's the case, then what we experience as the flow of time might not be something happening out there in the universe at all. It might be something happening here, in the brain. A way of processing events in sequence, giving us the sensation of moving through time, even if, from a larger perspective, everything is already laid out. And that's where it starts to feel unsettling, because it raises questions about things we assume are fundamental. Is the future already there in some sense? Is the past still existing somewhere, just not accessible to us? Is the present actually special, or just the point our consciousness happens to be focused on? And the really strange part is that you can't step outside of this experience to check. You can't pause time, move freely through it, or observe it from the outside. You're locked into the flow, even if that flow might not be objectively real in the way it feels. And that's what makes it stick, because it suggests that one of the most basic aspects of reality, something that structures every moment of your life, might not be what you think it is at all. Not a river you're moving through, but something more like a landscape you're scanning, one moment at a time. And if that's true, then the passage of time isn't something happening to you. It's something you're experiencing, which is a very different idea. And once you start thinking about it that way, it's hard to go back to seeing time as something simple ever again. Story 22. Will there be a universal translator? With AI picking up on its pattern recognition, will we one day be able to map out all speech patterns of known life on this planet? Seems possible lately. What happens when you can be the mediator between hunter/prey? Do they stop their natural ways through communication that's now possible because of us? Or are we to do even better by creating an even better food system for all life on this planet without the natural sacrifice? What happens when all life can just hang out as homies? Does the global consciousness reach ascension? Story 23. Cellular vaults are one of those mysteries that don't get talked about much outside of biology, but the more you look into them, the stranger they feel, especially because they've been known about for decades, and we still don't have a clear answer for what they actually do, because these things aren't rare or obscure in the sense of being hard to find. They're present in many eukaryotic cells, highly conserved across species, and structurally very distinct. Large barrel-shaped complexes made up of proteins and RNA, almost like tiny containers sitting inside the cell. And that's already unusual, because in biology, structures that are that consistent and that are well preserved across evolution usually have a clear, important function, something essential enough that it's been maintained over long periods of time. But with vaults, we are still not sure. There are theories, of course. Some suggest they're involved in transport, moving molecules within the cell. Others think they might play a role in immune response, or in regulating gene expression, or even in drug resistance in certain cells. But none of those explanations fully account for everything we see. Nothing has definitively pinned down their primary function in a way that feels complete. And that's what makes it so intriguing. Because this isn't some microscopic detail we just discovered last year. It's something that's been sitting there, inside cells, observed and studied for over 40 years, clearly important enough to be conserved, clearly structured enough to have a purpose, and yet still not fully understood. And when you think about that, it gets a little unsettling in a quiet way, because it reminds you that even at the most fundamental level of life, inside the cells that make up everything we are, there are still components whose roles we haven't fully figured out. Not because we haven't tried, but because the answer hasn't revealed itself yet. And that gap, sitting right at the core of biology, makes you realize that even in a field as detailed and advanced as molecular biology, there are still pieces of the puzzle that are right in front of us, and still just out of reach. Story 24. Greek fire is one of those mysteries that feels especially strange because it's not just something we don't fully understand. It's something that clearly existed, was used effectively, and then somehow disappeared from practical knowledge entirely. Because historical accounts describe it as this terrifying weapon used by the Byzantines, something that could be launched from ships, cling to surfaces, and keep burning even when it hit water, which already makes it feel almost unnatural compared to what you'd expect from that time period. And it wasn't just a one-off invention either. It was used repeatedly, strategically, and apparently with enough consistency that it became a major advantage in naval warfare, especially in defending Constantinople, where it played a key role in stopping invading fleets. So, whatever it was, it worked, and it worked well enough that people feared it. But the actual composition of Greek fire has never been definitively confirmed because the formula was kept extremely secret, passed down in a controlled way, and eventually lost as the Byzantine Empire declined. So now we're left with descriptions, accounts of how it behaved, how it was deployed, what it looked like in action, but not the exact method of creating it. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it suggests that there was a practical, repeatable technology, something closer to an early form of chemical weaponry, that we can't fully reconstruct with certainty, even with all our modern knowledge. There are theories, of course. mixtures involving petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, various resins, combinations that could explain the burning properties and the resistance to water. But none of them are confirmed in a way that completely matches every description. And that leaves this strange gap. A weapon that clearly existed, clearly had a real impact on history, and yet now sits in that space between known and unknown, where we understand the effects, but not the exact cause. And that's what makes it stick, because it's not just a mystery about something ancient. It's a reminder that knowledge can exist, be refined, be used effectively, and still be lost. Not destroyed in some dramatic way, but simply not carried forward. Which makes you wonder how many other things like that have existed and quietly disappeared with time. Story 25. What happens to some of the people who disappear in national forests is one of those mysteries that feels especially unsettling because it's not ancient history or some distant, hard-to-relate-to event. It's something that still happens in places people visit all the time. Because on the surface, national parks and forests feel like controlled environments. Marked trails, maps, ranger stations, other visitors nearby, the sense that even though it's nature, it's still somewhat contained and monitored. But once you get deeper into it, that perception starts to fall apart. These areas are massive. Dense terrain, uneven ground, weather that can change quickly, limited visibility, and huge stretches where you can be completely alone without realizing how far you've drifted from anything recognizable. And that's where people can disappear. Sometimes it's explainable. Someone gets lost, injured, disoriented, exposed to the elements, and the environment itself does the rest, which is already more than enough to account for many cases. But then there are the ones that don't resolve cleanly. People who vanish without leaving behind clear tracks, belongings found in odd places, or no trace at all, despite search efforts that seem like they should have found something. And the unsettling part isn't necessarily that there's something mysterious out there, it's that the environment is so vast and complex that it can simply absorb someone, completely. Between wildlife, terrain, weather, time, and the sheer scale of these places, it's possible for evidence to disappear, for remains to go unnoticed, for events to unfold in ways that leave very little behind. And that's what makes it stick, because it challenges that sense of control. It shows that even in a world where we feel mapped and connected, there are still places where you can step off a path, make a wrong turn, or encounter something unexpected, and just not come back. Not because of anything supernatural, but because nature itself doesn't guarantee that everything gets explained or recovered. And the idea that someone can simply be there one moment and then effectively erased from the record the next is what makes it feel so unsettling. Story 26. The monoliths that started appearing in random places and then disappearing again are one of those modern mysteries that aren't necessarily dangerous or dark, but still feel strangely unsettling because of how little context there was when they first showed up. Because you've got these tall metallic structures suddenly appearing in remote locations, deserts, mountains, isolated landscapes, places where you wouldn't expect someone to just casually install something like that without anyone noticing. And at first, there's no clear explanation. No official announcement, no obvious creator, just this object standing there, reflecting light, looking almost deliberately placed in a way that feels symbolic or intentional, but without any clear message attached to it, which immediately makes people start speculating. Art project, marketing stunt, something coordinated, something random, and before any of those questions can fully settle, they disappear. Sometimes removed by unknown individuals, sometimes taken down without much explanation, sometimes just gone as quietly as they appeared. And that's what gives it that slightly eerie feeling. Not because the objects themselves are threatening, but because of the pattern. Appear, get attention, disappear. No clear origin, no consistent explanation tying all of them together in a satisfying way. And it creates this weird contrast with how connected the world is supposed to be now. Because in a time where almost everything is documented, tracked, shared instantly, you'd expect something like that to have a clear source right away. But instead, for a while at least, it felt like something just happened. Like objects were being placed into the landscape without context, without explanation, and then removed again before anyone could fully pin down the story behind them. And even though most likely explanations point toward human-made installations or art projects, the way it unfolded, the timing, the locations, the lack of immediate clarity, made it feel just a little more mysterious than it probably should have been, which is why it stuck with people, because it was simple, but not fully explained at the moment. And sometimes that's all it takes for something to feel like a mystery. Story 27, The Great Amherst Mystery, is one of those cases that sits in that uncomfortable gray area where it's not easy to just dismiss it outright, but it's also not something you can cleanly explain, which is exactly why it's managed to stick around for so long. Because on the surface, it sounds like something you'd immediately label as a hoax or exaggeration. You've got reports of unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, physical disturbances happening around a young woman named Esther Cox in the late 1800s, all escalating in a way that feels almost too dramatic to be taken at face value. And normally, that would be enough to write it off. But then you start looking at the accounts more closely, and what makes it interesting is that it wasn't just one person claiming these things. There were multiple witnesses, people who were reportedly present, who saw or heard things themselves, and who didn't seem to have any clear reason to fabricate what they were describing, especially given the social context of the time, where making those kinds of claims could just as easily damage your credibility rather than benefit you. So now it becomes less straightforward, because you're not just dealing with a single narrative. You're dealing with overlapping perspectives, each adding a piece to something that doesn't quite fit into a simple explanation. And that's where the mystery really lives. Not necessarily whether something supernatural happened, but in the gap between what was reported and what can be confidently explained. Because there are possible explanations, psychological stress, misinterpretation, exaggeration over time, even deliberate deception at some level, but none of them fully account for every detail in a way that feels completely satisfying. And that's what makes it stick, because it's not clean, it's not resolved. It's one of those cases where you can lean one way or the other, but you never quite land on something definitive. And that lingering uncertainty, especially when tied to real people who seem convinced by what they experienced, is what keeps it fascinating. Because it leaves you with that one uncomfortable possibility that something happened and we don't fully know what it was. Story 28. Gravity is one of those things that feels completely understood on the surface because we can describe it, measure it, predict it with incredible accuracy. And yet, when you look a little deeper, it turns out we don't actually understand what it is at a fundamental level, because we experience gravity constantly. It's the most familiar force there is, the thing that keeps you grounded, keeps planets in orbit, shapes galaxies, something so reliable that it feels almost invisible in everyday life. And scientifically, we have very powerful models for it. Einstein's general relativity describes gravity not as a force in the traditional sense, but as the curvature of space-time caused by mass and energy, which explains everything from falling objects to the motion of stars with remarkable precision. But even that is more of a description than an explanation. It tells us how gravity behaves, how it affects things, how to calculate it, but not what it fundamentally is in the same way we might hope to understand. And the deeper you go into physics, the more that gap becomes obvious. Because gravity doesn't fit neatly with quantum mechanics, which describes the other fundamental forces. And despite decades of work, we still don't have a fully unified theory that brings gravity and quantum physics together in a complete, consistent way. So you end up with this strange situation. One of the most familiar aspects of reality, something we rely on constantly, something we can predict with extreme accuracy. And yet, at the deepest level, it's still kind of mysterious. We don't know if it's mediated by a particle like the other forces. We don't fully understand how it behaves at the smallest scales. We don't know how to reconcile it with the rest of our physical theories. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it shows that even the most basic, taken for granted parts of the universe can still hold unanswered questions, not at the edges of knowledge, but right at the center of it. And the idea that something as fundamental as gravity, something that shapes the entire structure of the universe, is still not fully understood, is what makes it quietly unsettling, because it means there are still pieces of reality that we're interacting with every second without fully knowing what they are. Story 29, Oceanic Flight 815, is one of those mysteries that feels real when you first hear it, especially because it's presented in such a grounded documentary-style way. But it actually comes from the TV show Lost, which is why the details seem so oddly specific and unsettling. Because in the show, the official story is that the plane crashed and all passengers died, with bodies recovered, but as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that what people were told doesn't line up with what actually happened to the survivors. And that's where that eerie question comes from. If the official version is false, where did the bodies come from? Which is exactly the kind of detail the show uses to pull you deeper into the mystery, because it takes something very real, a plane crash, an investigation, recovered remains, and then introduces inconsistencies that make the whole situation feel off in a way that's hard to ignore. And what makes it stick with people is how believable it feels. The way it blends realism with unanswered questions, the way it presents information in fragments, the way it lets you sit with those gaps instead of immediately explaining them, all of it makes it feel like something that could exist outside of fiction. But in reality, it's a constructed mystery, a narrative designed to create exactly that kind of reaction, where you start questioning the official story, looking for hidden explanations, trying to reconcile details that don't quite fit together. And that's why it works so well, because it taps into the same kind of curiosity as real-world mysteries, but gives itself the freedom to push things further, to leave things unresolved longer, to build that sense of something bigger just out of reach. So, while it's not a real unsolved case, the feeling it creates is very real, that sense of something not adding up, of a story that looks complete on the surface but has something missing underneath. And that's exactly what makes it so memorable. Story 30. What caused the downfall of the Minoan civilization is one of those mysteries where we have pieces of the puzzle that seem convincing on their own, but when you try to put them all together into one clean explanation, it never quite fits perfectly, because the Minoans weren't some fragile or isolated culture. They were advanced, connected, thriving across Crete and the surrounding region, with complex cities, trade networks, art, architecture, all the signs of a stable and successful civilization that had been around for a long time. And then something starts to go wrong. One of the biggest suspects is the massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern Santorini, which was one of the largest eruptions in human history, powerful enough to cause widespread devastation, ash fallout, and possibly massive tsunamis that would have hit coastal settlements. And that alone sounds like it should explain everything, but it doesn't fully. Because while the eruption would have caused serious disruption, evidence suggests that Minoan culture didn't just instantly vanish right after it, which means whatever happened was probably more complex than a single catastrophic event. So, then you start layering in other factors: economic strain from disrupted trade, environmental damage, potential invasions or influence from Mycenaean Greeks, who eventually seemed to take over parts of the region, internal instability that might have built up over time. And now, instead of one cause, you've got a combination. A civilization that was hit by a major natural disaster, weakened, and then gradually overtaken or transformed by other pressures. And that's what makes it feel unresolved. Because there's no single moment where you can point and say, that's when it ended. It's more like a slow fading, a series of blows that together were enough to bring it down. And the unsettling part is how familiar that pattern feels, because it's not a dramatic one-time collapse. It's a system that was strong, then stressed, then slowly lost its ability to maintain itself. And when you look at it that way, it becomes less about one lost civilization, and more about how complex systems can fail in ways that aren't immediately obvious while they're happening, which is what makes it stick. Because it's not just a mystery about the past, it's a reminder that even something stable and successful can unravel without a single clear cause. Story 31. The disappearance of Varig cargo, Flight 967, is one of those mysteries that feels especially strange, because it's not just a missing aircraft. It's a missing aircraft carrying something incredibly valuable that should have been easy to track, and yet it just vanished without a trace. Because this wasn't a passenger flight lost in some chaotic situation. It was a cargo flight in 1979, flying a fairly standard route from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro, with scheduled stops along the way. And on board was a shipment of paintings by the Japanese artist Manabu Mabe, works that were not only culturally important, but also extremely valuable. And then somewhere over the Pacific, the plane disappears. No distress signal. No confirmed wreckage, no clear last moment that explains what went wrong, just a loss of contact, followed by silence. And that's already unusual, because even in difficult conditions, you would expect at least some kind of indication, some final transmission, some debris field eventually found, something that points toward a cause. But in this case, nothing definitive ever turned up, which opens the door to all kinds of possibilities. Mechanical failure, sudden catastrophic event, navigation issues, but also more speculative ideas like theft or deliberate disappearance, especially given the cargo on board, which adds this extra layer that makes the whole situation feel less straightforward than a typical aviation accident. And that's what makes it stick, because it's not just a plane that went down. It's a plane that vanished in a way that left almost no clear trail behind, carrying something valuable enough to make people question whether there was more going on than just an accident. And the fact that decades later we still don't have a definitive answer, no confirmed wreckage, no fully accepted explanation, leaves it sitting in that same uncomfortable space as other aviation mysteries. Not completely unknowable, but not resolved either. And that gap is what keeps it fascinating, because it feels like something that should have been explained by now, but it wasn't. Story 32. The disappearance of the SS Naronic is one of those quieter maritime mysteries that doesn't get as much attention as bigger, more famous disasters, but somehow feels even more unsettling because of how completely it vanished. Because this wasn't a tiny vessel slipping under the radar. It was a ship owned by the White Star Line, the same company later associated with the Titanic. And while the Naronic was a livestock carrier rather than a passenger liner, it was still a substantial, well-built ship making a routine transatlantic crossing in 1893. And then, it just never arrived. No distress signals, no confirmed sightings of wreckage, no survivors, nothing that clearly explained what happened in those final moments. Just silence. And in the North Atlantic, that's already ominous enough, because it's a harsh, unpredictable environment where storms, ice, and mechanical failures can turn dangerous very quickly. But even in those cases, you'd usually expect something to be found eventually. In this case, there were only fragments of possibility. A few lifeboats reportedly found some messages in bottles that may or may not have been authentic, but nothing definitive enough to build a clear narrative around. So what you're left with is a ship, a full crew, and a crossing that simply ended without explanation. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not dramatic in the way some disasters are, there's no single known moment of impact or failure, no confirmed sequence of events, just a disappearance that leaves behind an empty space in the record where an answer should be. And when you think about it, that's almost more unsettling than knowing what went wrong. Because at least with a known cause, you can understand it, place it in context, give it some kind of closure. But with something like the Naronic, there's just that gap, a beginning, a journey, and then nothing, which is exactly the kind of mystery that lingers. Story 33. What actually happened to Amelia Earhart on her final flight is one of those mysteries that has just enough evidence to build plausible explanations, but not enough to ever fully close the case, which is exactly why it continues to fascinate people nearly a century later. Because this wasn't some vague disappearance in an untracked part of the world. Earhart was one of the most famous pilots of her time, attempting a highly publicized around-the-world flight in 1937, with a planned route, support ships, radio communication, and a clear objective. And for most of the journey, everything was going according to plan. Then comes the final leg. She and her navigator, Fred Noonan, are trying to reach Howland Island, a tiny speck in the Pacific, and that's where things start to break down. Because radio transmissions become unclear, navigation becomes uncertain, and despite being close, they never manage to locate the island. And then, they're gone. No confirmed wreckage, no verified crash site, no definitive trace that explains exactly where or how it ended. And that's where the mystery branches out. The most widely accepted explanation is that they simply ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean after failing to find Howland Island, which fits with the available data and the difficulty of navigation over open water at the time. But then there are other theories, that they may have landed on a remote island like Nicomaroro and survived for some time before eventually dying there, supported by scattered evidence like bones, artifacts, and signs of temporary habitation that some researchers believe could be linked to them. Or more speculative ideas like capture by foreign forces, which tend to rely on less concrete evidence but still persist because of the lack of a definitive conclusion. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just a disappearance. It's a moment where everything was known up until a certain point, and then suddenly there's a gap, and that gap has never been fully filled. And the unsettling part is how close we might be to the answer. Because it's not like it happened in deep prehistory or without context. It happened in a relatively modern era, with records, communication, search efforts, and still, we don't know exactly what happened in those final hours, which leaves it sitting in that same space as the most enduring mysteries. Not completely unknowable, but just incomplete enough that it never quite resolves. And that lingering uncertainty is exactly what keeps it fascinating. Story 34. The question of whether a UFO really crashed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 is one of those mysteries where the official explanation exists, but the way the story unfolded makes people keep questioning it anyway. Because at first, the incident didn't even sound mysterious. A rancher found debris in a field, reported it, and the US military initially announced that they had recovered a flying disc, which immediately caught attention, especially at a time when public fascination with UFOs was just starting to take off. But then, very quickly, the story changed. The military walked it back and said it was actually a weather balloon, and that became the official explanation for years, which on its own might have settled things. Except for how abrupt and contradictory that shift felt to people. And that's where the mystery really begins. Because decades later, the explanation evolved again, with the government stating that the debris was part of a classified project called Project Mogul, which involved high-altitude balloons designed to detect nuclear tests, something that would have been secret at the time. And from a factual standpoint, that explanation fits a lot of the physical evidence. But the problem is, by the time that clarification came out, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Witness accounts, conflicting statements, rumors of recovered bodies, claims of cover-ups, all layered on top of each other in a way that made the official narrative feel incomplete to many people, even if it addressed the core event. And that's what makes it stick. Because it is not just about what happened in that field, it's about how the information was handled. The initial announcement, the quick reversal, the secrecy around military projects, All of it created this sense that there might be more to the story than what was publicly confirmed. And once that doubt is there, it's hard to fully remove it. So, even though there is a grounded explanation that aligns with known technology and historical context, the way the event unfolded left enough ambiguity that it never fully closed in the public imagination. Which is why Roswell isn't just a question about a crash. It's a question about the trust, interpretation, and whether the full story was ever actually told. And that's what keeps it fascinating. Story 35, how the statues on Easter Island, the Moai, were erected is one of those mysteries where we actually have several plausible explanations, but the sheer scale and precision of what was achieved still makes it feel almost unreal when you try to picture it happening in real life. Because these aren't small carvings. Some of these statues weigh dozens of tons, carved from volcanic rock in quarries like Rano Raraku, and then somehow transported across the island, sometimes for miles, before being raised upright on stone platforms called ahu. And for a long time, people assumed it must have required something beyond what the island's inhabitants were capable of, which is where all the more exotic theories came from. But over time, experimental archaeology has shown that it can be done using relatively simple methods. One of the most convincing ideas is that the statues were walked, upright using ropes, with groups of people rocking them side to side and inching them forward, which sounds almost too simple until you see demonstrations where it actually works, especially given the shape and center of gravity of the Moai. Other theories involve sledges, rollers, or dragging the statues horizontally, all of which are physically possible with enough coordination and manpower. And when it comes to erecting them, it likely involves building up ramps or using leverage techniques to gradually raise them into position rather than lifting them all at once. So, in terms of raw mechanics, it's explainable, but that's not what makes it stick. Because even if you accept the methods, you still have to account for the organization behind it, the planning, the labor force, the consistency across so many statues, all carried out on a relatively isolated island with limited resources. And that's where it becomes more than just an engineering question. It becomes a cultural one, a reflection of how much knowledge, coordination, and social structure existed there to make something like that possible over long periods of time. And I think that's why it still feels mysterious. Not because we have no idea how it was done, but because when you really try to imagine the full process, from quarry to transport to placement, repeated over and over again, it feels like something that should have left behind more obvious instructions or records than it did. Instead, we're left with the results. Massive, silent, standing figures that clearly required a deep understanding of technique, even if the exact details of that knowledge weren't fully preserved. And that gap between knowing it was possible and fully visualizing how it was consistently achieved is what keeps it fascinating. Story 36, sleeping sickness, especially in the context of the mysterious epidemic known as Encephalitis lethargica, is one of those medical mysteries that feels almost surreal the more you read about it, because it's not just a disease we don't fully understand. It's something that seemed to appear, affect thousands of people in a very specific and strange way, and then largely disappear without a clear explanation. Because during the early 20th century, around the time of World War I, people across different parts of the world started developing this condition, where they would become extremely lethargic, sometimes falling into prolonged states of sleep or semi-consciousness, almost like they were frozen in time. Some patients could be awake but unable to move or respond properly, others would sleep for long periods, and in many cases, even those who survived were left with lasting neurological effects, including symptoms similar to Parkinson's disease. And what makes it so unsettling is how poorly understood it still is. At the time, doctors tried to link it to infections, possibly related to the influenza pandemic, but no definitive cause was ever confirmed, and despite advances in medicine, we still don't have a clear answer for what exactly triggered it or why it behaved the way it did. Then, just as strangely as it appeared, it faded. The epidemic declined, cases became rare, and it never returned on the same scale, leaving behind this historical footprint of something that clearly happened, was widely observed, documented, studied, and yet never fully explained. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it challenges this assumption that with enough time and research, we eventually figure things out completely. In this case, we didn't. We understand parts of it, we can describe the symptoms, the progression, the impact, but the core cause, the exact mechanism, the reason it emerged when it did and then receded, is still uncertain. And that leaves it sitting in that strange category of mysteries that aren't ancient or speculative, but real, relatively recent, and still not fully understood, which somehow makes it even more unsettling, because it shows that even in fields like medicine, where we've made enormous progress, there are still things that can happen, and then quietly slip back out of reach without giving us a complete answer. Story 37, the Aurora incident, is one of those stories that sits right on the edge between historical curiosity and something that almost feels too strange to take at face value, which is probably why it keeps coming up whenever people talk about early UFO lore. Because according to reports from 1897 in Aurora, Texas, something described as an airship crashed into a windmill on a farm, causing an explosion. And when people went to investigate, they supposedly found the body of a pilot who was described as not of this world. And what makes it interesting isn't just the claim itself, but the timing. This was decades before modern UFO culture really took shape, before Roswell, before the idea of extraterrestrial visitors became widespread in the way we think of it now, which makes the story feel oddly ahead of its time. According to the accounts, the being was buried in a local cemetery, and debris from the crash was reportedly scattered or even placed into a well, which adds this layer of physical detail that makes it feel more grounded, even if those details are hard to verify today. But when you look at it more closely, things start to blur. The original story came from a newspaper article, and over time, skepticism grew about whether it was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or even intentionally fabricated, possibly as a way to bring attention to the town, especially during a period when Aurora was struggling economically. And then there's the fact that later attempts to investigate the site didn't produce clear, definitive evidence that confirms the more extraordinary parts of the story, which leaves it in that familiar gray area. Because it's not completely dismissed, but it's not confirmed either. And that's what makes it stick, because it's one of those early cases where you can see the structure of a modern mystery forming: a strange object, a crash, a non-human pilot, a burial, missing or unclear evidence. All the elements that would later become part of UFO narratives. And whether it was a hoax, a misunderstanding, or something else entirely, it ends up feeling less like a solved event and more like a story that never quite settled into a definitive explanation, which is exactly the kind of mystery that tends to linger, not because it's proven, but because it's just plausible enough to keep people wondering. Story 38, The Big Gray Man, or Amherst, is one of those mysteries that feels less like a clear event and more like an experience that keeps repeating in just enough consistent ways to make it hard to completely dismiss. Because it's associated with Ben MacDhui, one of the highest mountains in Scotland, and for years, climbers and hikers have reported this strange sensation when they're up there, not just seeing something, but feeling like they're being watched, followed, or accompanied by something they can't quite identify. And then there are the actual sightings. People describe a large, shadowy figure, sometimes humanoid, sometimes indistinct, appearing in the mist or just at the edge of visibility, often accompanied by heavy footsteps, or this overwhelming sense of presence that doesn't match anything physically there. And what makes it interesting is that some of the people who reported these encounters weren't prone to exaggeration or storytelling, including experienced climbers who were familiar with the environment and not easily shaken, which adds a layer of credibility, or at least makes it harder to write off as pure imagination. But at the same time, there are possible explanations that don't require anything supernatural. Things like the Brocken specter, where your shadow is cast onto mist and appears much larger and distorted, combined with isolation, altitude, weather conditions, and the psychological effects of being alone in a harsh environment, which can amplify perception and create that feeling of presence. And that's where it sits, between explanation and experience. Because even if you can account for the visual phenomenon, that doesn't always fully explain the feeling people describe, that deep, instinctive sense that something is there with them. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just about seeing something, it's about perceiving something. Something that might be explainable in terms of light and psychology, but still feels real enough in the moment to leave a lasting impression. And like a lot of these mysteries, it lives in that gap, where the explanation exists, but the experience still feels a little too vivid to completely ignore. Story 39, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery, is one of those cases that feels especially eerie, not because of what we know, but because of how ordinary everything should have been. Because this wasn't some remote expedition or dangerous mission in unknown territory. It was a lighthouse off the coast of Scotland in 1900, staffed by 3 experienced keepers whose job was routine, structured, and well understood. And then one day, a relief crew arrives, and something is wrong. The lighthouse is unmanned, no one there, no sign of the keepers anywhere. And what makes it unsettling is the condition everything was left in. Some things suggested a sudden departure, like a chair overturned, oilskins missing, as if at least one of them had gone outside in a hurry. But other details didn't fully line up, like uneaten meals or clocks stopped, depending on the account, which created this feeling that whatever happened wasn't part of a normal routine. And outside, nothing. No bodies, no clear signs of struggle, just the ocean, the cliffs, and the complete absence of the 3 men. So, naturally, theories started forming. The most grounded explanation is that they were swept away by a rogue wave while inspecting something near the cliffs, which is entirely possible given how violent the seas can be in that area, especially if more than one man went out at once. But even that leaves questions. Why would all 3 leave the lighthouse unattended when protocol usually required at least one person to stay inside? Why did the scene inside feel slightly off to those who first reported it? And why does the whole event feel more mysterious than similar accidents that have clear explanations? And I think that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just about the disappearance itself, it's about the atmosphere around it. The isolation of the location, the silence of the lighthouse when it should have been occupied, the idea of something happening in a place that was supposed to be controlled and predictable. And even if the most likely explanation is natural, accidental, and grounded in reality, there's still that lingering feeling that something happened out there, on those rocks, in that weather. And whatever it was, it took 3 people at once, and left almost nothing behind. Which is exactly the kind of mystery that stays with you. Story 40, the disappearance of the USS Cyclops, is one of those mysteries that feels almost impossible when you look at the scale of it, because we're not talking about a small vessel slipping away unnoticed. This was a massive US Navy cargo ship with over 300 people on board, just vanishing without a single confirmed trace. Because in 1918, during World War I, the Cyclops was transporting a load of manganese ore and sailing through the Caribbean toward Baltimore, following a route that should have been routine, especially for a ship of its size and capability. And then, it never arrived. No distress signal, no confirmed wreckage, no debris field, no survivors, nothing that clearly indicates what happened in those final moments. And that's what makes it so unsettling, because even in difficult maritime conditions, you would expect something to surface eventually, some fragment, some piece of evidence that points toward a cause. But in this case, there was just silence, which immediately opened the door to theories. Structural failure due to the heavy cargo, a sudden storm or rogue wave, mechanical issues that led to a catastrophic sinking, all of which are plausible, especially given the ship's design and the conditions it might have encountered. But none of them were ever confirmed. And then, over time, it became associated with the Bermuda Triangle, which added another layer of speculation, even though there's no solid evidence tying it to anything beyond the challenges of the sea itself. And that's what makes it stick. Because it's not just a disappearance. It's a disappearance of something large, important, and well documented, in a time where you would expect at least some kind of record or clue to remain. And the fact that it didn't leaves this gap that's hard to ignore, because when something that big, with that many people, can just vanish in a way that leaves behind no clear answer, it challenges that sense that everything can eventually be explained. And even if the most likely explanation is something natural, something grounded in known risks, the absence of definitive evidence keeps it sitting in that same uncomfortable space, where you can suggest what probably happened, but never say for sure, and that's exactly what makes it linger.